Today, we're diving deep into a single media event that absolutely sent shockwaves through the political world. But here's the twist. We're not here to re-argue the points or pick a side. Nope. Instead, we're going to perform what an academic paper calls a rhetorical autopsy to understand how the argument was actually built. So let's set the scene. The year is 2026, February. The event? A super combative interview between commentator Tucker Carlson and the U.S. ambassador to Israel, Mike Huckabee. And it created an immediate international firestorm. News outlets like the Times of Israel here weren't just calling it a debate, they were framing it as a full-on battle for the soul of a political party. All right, so Section 1, a battle of words. And just to be super clear, our goal here isn't to relitigate who was right or wrong. We're using a really detailed academic paper as our guide, one that performs this rhetorical autopsy on the interview, and we're going to walk right through its biggest findings. At the very heart of the interview was this one explosive claim. Now, according to the paper we're looking at, this argument was pushed forward through a few key angles, like questioning the ancestral connection of Ashkenazi Jews to the region, and even accusing American supporters of Israel of having a kind of dual loyalty. This really set the stage for a massive conflict over facts, history, and ethics.
Okay, on to our next section, the Sophistry toolkit. So how was this argument actually put together? The paper argues that this wasn't just a simple disagreement. It was what they called the deployment of a specific rhetorical toolkit, a system of arguing that's built on logical fallacies designed to win over an audience.
And get this, the paper's authors actually cataloged 25, that's 25, distinct logical fallacies used in this one interview. Now, according to the paper, that sheer number suggests this wasn't accidental. It points to a consistent, deliberate strategy. So to see how it works, let's just break down one of the most common ones. The paper says the strawman fallacy was a go-to tool here. The idea is pretty simple, actually. Instead of dealing with your opponent's real argument, you build up a twisted, more extreme version of it, a strawman, and then you knock that down. It makes it look like you won, but you never even touched the real point. And here we go, a perfect example of the technique in action. The paper points to this exact moment. On the left, you've got Ambassador Huckabee's actual point. It's a complex, technical, military legal framework. But look at the right. That's how it was reframed. So you told me 14-year-olds deserve to die? The paper argues this is a deliberate move, shifting the whole conversation from a technical detail to a powerful, emotionally gut-wrenching but false accusation. So yeah, the paper's analysis says that's a textbook strawman. But then it argues that the accusation goes way deeper, that it actually taps into a really old, really ugly anti-Semitic trope called the blood libel, the false, centuries-old claim that Jews murder non-Jewish children. All right, so now that the rhetorical method has been identified, the paper moves on to deconstruct the interview's core claims using outside evidence. This is where it gets really interesting, because they bring in hard data from genetics, military ethics, and history to see how the arguments actually stack up against observable facts. The first big claim the paper tackles is about ancestry. A pretty big chunk of the interview was spent questioning the genetic link of Ashkenazi Jews to the Middle East. This was basically a way of bringing up the old Khazar hypothesis, a theory that suggests they're descended from a Turkic people, not ancient Israelites. So what does the actual genetic science say? Well, the paper basically pulls out the receipts. It compiles a ton of peer-reviewed research from huge institutions like Harvard, Stanford, and Hebrew University. And the finding, across multiple independent studies, is really consistent. Ashkenazi Jewish DNA traces back to a Levantine Near Eastern origin, not to the Khazar people. The paper presents this as the scientific consensus, which directly contradicts the whole premise of those questions. Okay, so the paper then pivots from genetics to another huge flashpoint in the interview, the ethics of military action and civilian harm. The central accusation here was one of exceptional cruelty and a total disregard for civilian life. To analyze this, the paper turns to the work of John Spencer, who's the chair of urban warfare studies at West Point. Spencer's whole argument is that to judge a military's actions fairly, you can't just look at the tragic outcomes. You have to look at the inputs, the steps they took to prevent civilian casualties. And he documents all these measures, like specific evacuation warnings and roof knocking, that he says are totally unprecedented in the entire history of urban warfare. Now, this is where we get to what the paper presents as its most stunning historical parallel. It claims that to really understand the logical structure of the arguments being made in 2026, you actually have to rewind the clock. by 1,600 years.
This slide right here illustrates the paper's main historical thesis. It draws a direct line from the arguments made in the interview all the way back to anti-Semitic tropes from a 4th century archbishop named John Chrysostom. The paper's arguing that the logical architecture is exactly the same, attributing a unique bloodlust, claiming a foreign allegiance, and saying that the Jewish people have been superseded. In the 4th century, it was spiritual. In the 21st, it's genetic. The language changed, but the underlying structure, the paper concludes, is identical.
So, where does all of this analysis leave us?
Well, the paper frames the entire conflict as a choice between two fundamentally different ways of approaching the truth, two competing worldviews that start from completely different places and, no surprise, end up in vastly different realities.
And this table from the paper just lays it all out so clearly. You can see how on every single key dimension, from genetic science to military ethics to strategic benefit, the paper contrasts the two approaches. In one column, you have a direction it says is based on evidence. In the other, a direction it says is founded on debunked theories and ancient historical tropes. The conflict is presented as a clear choice between these two roads. And this brings us to the paper's final verdict. The authors conclude that what was really being fought over in this interview wasn't just policy or politics, it was the standard of truth itself. The core battle was between a worldview based on observable, verifiable evidence and one based on what it identifies as sophisticated rhetorical manipulation. Which, of course, leaves us with a huge question. One that goes way beyond this single interview. When we're all bombarded with conflicting stories and contested facts, how do we decide? What is our standard for truth?